Tips for R01 Success, Informed Perspectives from NIH Study Section Reviewers. My name is Kai Goosens, and I am a professor in psychiatry. I am also the Director of Mentorship Enrichment in the Office of Faculty Development, and it's the Office of Faculty Development who is sponsoring today's event. Next slide, please. The mission of our office is to support all faculty as they develop through all stages of their scientific, clinical, educational, and administrative careers. And we are committed to helping create an equitable, just, and inclusive culture that cultivates the well-being and professional fulfillment of all of our faculty. And we do that through programming in 3 key areas, which are shown on the right. Those are career advancement, mentorship enrichment, and leadership development. And today's event really falls into the career advancement portion of our programming. Next slide, please. Just a few bits of information before we get started. So we are recording this event and we will be sharing it with all of you after the event. It will probably take a week or 2 before we send that link out. When you signed up for this panel, we asked you to submit questions, and a bunch of you did. And so we have collated those questions, and we're going to have the panelists address those first before we then kind of open the floor to questions that you have currently. But during the entirety of the panel, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions in real time. And that doesn't mean that it's going to get answered right then and there. We might answer it in the Q&A feature itself, or it might be addressed by the panelists themselves after we address the pre-submitted questions. And if there are any questions that we don't get to today, if there are too many, then we can answer those offline later. And so the way that we'll be doing these questions is I'm going to read the questions and show them to our panelists one at a time, and they'll be answering those individually in sort of a specific order that we've pre-assigned. Next slide, please. So we have 3 panelists who are supposed to be joining us today. Oh, good. Our 3rd panelist just showed up. Our panelists are Deanna Benson, who is a professor in neuroscience. She's also the director of the Microscopy and Advanced Imaging Core. We have Dr. Benjamin Chen, who is the vice chair for research in the Department of Medicine and also a professor in departments of medicine and the Division of Infectious Diseases. And we have Dr. Ana Fernandez-Sesma, who is a professor in microbiology and also a professor in medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases. And so I will ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the questions. So maybe Dr. Chen, you could start.
Yes, hi, I'm Ben Chen. I'm in the Department of Medicine and Infectious Disease Division, and have been reviewing grants for about 15 years or so. I've spent especially a long period of time on the NIAID fellowship study section. But early on in my career, I also had the good fortune of getting a what was called the Avant-Garde Award from NIAID, from NIDA rather. And so I've done a lot of review in NIDA on some of those Pioneer Awards, the Avant-Garde Awards, and a lot of ad hoc work on special emphasis panels for NIDA as well as for NIAID. Yeah, and I was actually also initially funded by NIGMS, and so have some perspectives on applying to different institutes for your different grants.
Okay. Dr. Fernandez-Sesma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, I'm Ana Fernandez-Sesma. I am in microbiology, and my main experience with grant reviewing and submission has been in NIID for NIH. And I actually served as a permanent member of a study section virology B during 6 years. At that time, they allowed 6 years and you could do 2 meetings per year. And then I did just finish serving for 4 years in the Scientific Council of NIAID, the Division of Infectious Diseases and Microbiology, which is the other part of grant reviewing that deals with discussing like select pay and other, concepts or new RFAs. And it's actually quite interesting to participate. I've also participated in study sections for the Department of Defense, DARPA, and other different types of funding that they have, because I work in emerging diseases and they have a lot of applications in that arena. So today is about R01s, but I have been also doing this for other agencies.
Mm-hmm. Great. Dr. Benson, I don't know if you are connected yet. If you are, can you let me know? All right. Well, our third panelist is Dr. Benson, and she's having a little bit of technical difficulty. So,
okay. So can you hear my voice?
We can hear you. Yes. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
All right. And so I'm gonna log out in a second and log back in on my phone. I have been having, as you said, technical difficulties. I'm so sorry, but I'll just introduce myself really quickly. So yes, I'm Deanna Benson. I'm in the Department of Neuroscience. I have been serving on panels for over 20 years, and I've been a permanent member of 2 panels. And I have been the principally focused on R01s. I've also served for 2 years on a postdoctoral fellowship panel, and I have reviewed on a panel for core grants for NINDS. Most of those grants in total have been for neuroscience-based institutes. So that would be NINDS, NIMH, NIDA, and NIA. The study section has reviewed the study sections I've been involved in have reviewed grants that are relevant to all of those institutes. I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay, great. Thanks. We'll send some questions your way when you log back in. So
yes.
All right. Okay. So at this point, as I mentioned, we'll go to the questions that were submitted ahead of time. And I'm going to read those. So I'm going to give this first one to Dr. Chen. So this is the question. How do you strike a balance between framing your project as, on one hand, highly innovative and groundbreaking, and by implication, potentially higher risk, and on the other hand, feasible and having a high chance of success due to a rock solid approach, and by implication, potentially less groundbreaking?
That's a great question, and I think it's a tricky balance to strike for any R01 application. I think in addition to those two parameters, I think you also want to kind of convince the review panel that you are the best person or the right person to answer, the question that you are posing, and so obviously, I think you need to really think about what data you've generated, what you're known, what your publications to date, what the strengths are. And I think a lot of the best advice, or some of the best advice I received as an early or as a new investigator, was to really focus in on a key paper which you think would launch not only your independent publication record, but also could serve as a bit of a platform for your R01. And I think what you try to do in that case is really, I think obviously when you're building your proposal, you want to have some innovative elements, and I think it's also not to be underestimated, the relative significance of an innovative hypothesis as well. So I do think in addition, I think sometimes people get a little caught up in, bringing in like the latest technology, but if you don't have a really sound tech, like if you're doing just a single cell grant, that's probably not going to hack it if you're just doing what everyone else is how they're using this innovative technology to apply to their problem. So I think having a a solid hypothesis and some innovative ideas, as well as innovative technologies that are at hand. In some cases, you might be able to add some innovative technologies through collaborations. So having a great team can also be a nice enhancing method for increasing innovation and working in between spaces, innovating in terms of topics. So if you have some synergies with other investigators, but it is really a tricky balance. So you really, feasibility is really critical. So like if you have a foundation of results, which is forming your main hypothesis, I think that's always a really important place to start. Maybe I'll let Anna chime in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add a couple of things, and I think I totally agree with what Ben was just saying. And I think one of the more common mistakes is like for investigators to try to show everything they can do. And I think then normally they are perceived as too ambitious. So like to stick to what you really can do and what is really needed to answer that really important question. So I think it's more important to have a specific question. And if you bring in a team of collaborators, I think it's important to emphasize how building this team makes it possible to address the question so that they couldn't do it individually, so you're adding something more to this research that it couldn't be done by the individual labs. So don't be afraid of getting collaborators, because they enrich or they actually provide something that by the individual labs would not be able to do. So I think that's really important to emphasize.
That's great advice. Thank you both. Dr. Benson, are you ready for a question? Okay, you have to unmute yourself. So, all right,
Ready.
Great. All right, so this next one I'm going to direct to you. It's, can you talk to us about the process of engaging with program officers? So things like the timeline, if you want them to look at a specific game draft, how many insights can they generally provide, et cetera?
So it's generally speaking, most program officers are really happy to get questions, and particularly from junior people. But in general, it's really, really good practice to engage your program officer, because your program officer can be your advocate. They have seen a lot of grants. They have their own priorities and objectives. And a lot of times you will have like two things that are interesting to you, and your program officer is much more interested in one. It's very good to kind of morph a little more toward the thing that the institute is interested in, and you won't know unless you talk to your program officer. Most of them are more than happy to read Ames pages and give you feedback. I have found it absolutely invaluable. And if you're on a borderline score, they are the ones that advocate for you to be funded. And so it's good for you to be sure that you have a conversation with them, that they know what your grant's about, and that it is kind of aligned with what their objectives are.
Did you have any advice about the timeline on which they should do that?
Yeah, I mean, the earlier the better. It's one of these things that most of them try to make themselves available at meetings. It's good to kind of chat with them and get a sense of what institute you're most aligned with, and kind of you can push toward particular program officers, but it's best to meet them as early as possible and to engage them well before you're ready to submit the grant, because they may have really solid advice for you that'll take some time to address.
Yeah, if I can add something from the point of view of counsel, that's exactly right what Diana was saying. Like they want you to give them in a nutshell what your grant is actually about, what is the innovation or what is the impact that your research will do in the field. And maybe sometimes you have reviewers that don't agree with each other, and that's why it doesn't really get maybe in the pay line, within the pay line. So it's important to have very good language to provide to your study section, because they're going to have to defend it in front of the other, the whole division. And the other thing is that we are their portfolio, so they love to have good grants and good projects that are successful. So they really want to hear from you. People are afraid of talking to program officers or talking to editors in journals, and we actually are giving them the material that they need. So they, we should not be afraid of contacting them, and they really get engaged in the science. So with some exceptions, but in general, I have had very, very good experience.
Great. Dr. Chen, did you have anything you wanted to?
Yeah, the other thing I might add is they're in the room when your grants are being discussed as well. And so the other timing for speaking with them is after your grant has been reviewed, and you can get some valuable insights into how to revise, because a lot of times there's things that you may need to read between the lines, or maybe not so clearly expressed about the sentiments in the room, and often program officers will give you pretty frank advice, right? So that's often very critical time to contact your program officer.
Absolutely. All right, so I think this next question I will direct to Dr. Fernandez-Sesma. In your experience, in which sections of the proposal do you give the most critical feedback?
I think the approach is absolutely crucial. I think you can have a grant in which everybody gives you really good scores. If the approach doesn't have a good score, the grant is not going to get a good score. So it's really the way you're planning to do your science. So I think it's important that you address the weaknesses, that address the shortcomings, or alternative approaches, pitfalls. Be very upfront when you write your grant, because when reviewers are reviewing grants, that's where they really give you basically the criticism that is gonna either help you get it funded or actually not. So I think that is actually the need of the grant. Sometimes people spend a lot of time writing about the innovation. Yes, they can be innovative, but that's not gonna make your grant funded unless you have a good approach. So the approach is really what I think is like in a paper, you have your results. It's really like the rest is just interpretation and trying to highlight things, but the approach has to be clear, has to be feasible. And I think that's where people should really put most of the effort, in my opinion.
Would anybody like to add to that?
I agree. I mean, the most feedback I give is the approach and the aims page. They have to be tight. And I think, we're all scientists that are reviewing it, and this is our comfort zone. So we feel most comfortable talking about the science and feeding back on the science. And it's competitive. So most people's ideas are pretty important and impactful. And the idea is, do you have a good plan that can move the field forward? And so absolutely, I spend the most time thinking about the approach and reviewing the approach.
The other thing that is important, and I'm sorry to cut again, is just sometimes I've seen grants in which there was some question about mentorship or the institution's commitment. So make sure you get it very clear, that they understand that you're in a place in which you get support, that you get mentorship, and make an effort. I think in China we don't need it. I think we have a pretty good institution, but I've seen some other places in which people struggle, providing enough proof that they have a good system of mentorship. And, these type of things are really important to mention, that you really have access to resources and to know how to advance and how to prepare these things. So I think that's also important feedback. It doesn't hurt the investigator, but it really helps the investigator if they know that the research can be performed and the investigator has colleagues and resources that can help. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, so this next question I will direct to Dr. Chen. It is, how do reviewers consider PI versus multi-PI if you are a junior investigator?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially these days since MPI, I think, is certainly used a lot more than it used to be, and can be a very effective way to pull together different expertise to make a very compelling grant. So MPI mechanisms, I think, are increasingly used for good reason, and it does allow for allowing credit for individual for contributions of multiple investigators to a particular grant. Now, for junior investigators, I think the key is in review is often independence, right? So if you're thinking about MPI, are you doing an MPI with your former PI or somebody who's maybe might be overshadowing you or working within a similar domain of research? I think that's sometimes a bit of a red flag, or particularly if you are a contact PI, right? So if you're going to be seen as the leader, then you kind of need to carefully craft the MPI statement and make sure that it's clear what you're contributing and how it's unique, and avoid some of the potential pitfalls and concerns that reviewers may have with regards to independence, or whether they are really contributing something novel. I think that the new investigator status, many times people want to have a single PI or not have an MPI for your first new investigator submission, although it's not necessarily. I think that's something you just need to consider on your own. Like an MPI grant as a contact PI would be a terrific first grant. So, and I think there are rules about using the new investigator status as an MPI as well. So
I would say that if possible, try to get your first grant as main PI or as PI alone. You could also ask like a strong collaborator to just be a collaborator. If they are already established, they might actually give you a strong letter of support or have a component, but I think it will help you like look more independent to be the PI. So don't be afraid of having those conversations early on and say, I really need to establish myself, establish my lab. Would you mind not being like a MPI with me, but being like having one part of the grant or one component of the grant? So I think it will help you, but I mean, it's not going to kill the grant, but I think it will show a stronger message that you're able to do it independently.
Yeah, I completely agree with what's been said. I think there's less discussion if a junior investigator is a single PI than if it's part of a multi-PI, because then there's always a discussion about who's playing what role. But if you, even as a single PI, if there's a close relationship with a senior person, you should directly address it in the grant. So in the roles, in you have like ample places to do it. I usually add a paragraph at the end of before I start the research design to say what the roles of different individuals are in the grant. So it's very, very clear as you're reading the grant who does what. Those kinds of things go a long way towards showing your leadership in the project.
Thank you all. All right, so this next question I will direct to Dr. Benson. After receiving your first R01 with the help of being new investigator, I think meaning early ESI, what's important or what traps lie ahead to receive a second R01?
Yeah, it's always been that the thought is that it's easier to get the first one and harder to get the second one. I mean, I think it's always hard to get an R01 no matter what your stage. And the study sections have now been there was a time where the study sections were told to keep the junior status of the PI in mind as you were reviewing it. And I think it's so vague that they kind of jettisoned that, and the emphasis has been judge it on the science. And then the decisions for where the funding lines lie are going to be made afterwards. And so the discussions still sit 99% with the science, but we're urged not to think too much about preliminary data or productivity. And so that makes sense. The difference is then productivity. They want to be able to see that you have taken the grant that you had and you generated data on it. Even if you go ahead and get an R01 in a different area, if you're not renewing the first R01, I think it's important to show that you had productivity from your own lab. And I think that's the main difference between the first and the second.
Anything else anyone would like to add?
One thing I would add is if you're also you do want to emphasize the productivity, but if you've accomplished everything in your goals for the first grant, you do need to make sure that the question is still of equal importance, right? So part of the process of renewing a grant versus maybe submitting a new is to also make a really equally compelling case as to the one you made in the first round, that the problem is even more interesting now than it was when you started, and maybe it's a part of that is sometimes shifting the focus of your renewal, and I guess that this is more specifically speaking to a renewal versus a new as your second R01. But I think that's also part of, if your research has shifted, then you might consider like a new R01 as your second R01 as well. So.
No, I also think that it used to be much more like the norm that you were kind of evaluated or judged by being able to renew your R01. I think that's not the case anymore. I think it's your ability to get funding and to get grants, and you might have to switch for whatever reason. Not every grant is meant to be renewable. You might actually do what you were set to do, and then maybe that type of research is not doable anymore for your lab, or you are not that interested anymore and you want to move on to something else. It's not going to be considered a bad thing. So as long as you are able to procure funding and put ideas out there, like do good research, I don't think there's going to be any criticism, oh, it didn't renew the first R01, and it used to be kind of like almost a rule. And I don't think people should get stuck with those kind of concepts. It's just, sometimes it's time to move on. Sometimes it's time to apply for a different type of grant. Sometimes it's not really, R01s right now are sometimes a little bit hard because the technology is so expensive that, sometimes you have to think of other mechanisms to really do what you want to do. And maybe the R01, you have to do non-modular, and it might not make any sense anymore to do R01s after the first one. So the first one could be the first step to do something else with your science. So I think there is much more flexibility right now than maybe 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Fernandez-Sesma, let's direct the next one to you. Are there funding mechanisms that are more suitable for those who are not qualified as new investigator status any longer and have been on grants as co-investigators rather than a PI, but who would like to transition to submitting grants as the PI?
I think it's really there is no rule. Again, I think you can decide what you want to do next. If you're you're no longer a new investigator, you've been participating in several grants as co-investigator. I think maybe proposing or trying to put together a team and do like a bigger grant, like a U19 or a program project, talking to your program officer, maybe there is a niche in your area of research that needs this program project, which is actually something that is not an RFA, responsible RFA. You can talk to your program officer and say, I have this team of people I can put together. Is there something that your division would be interested in? We do this particular research. And I think sometimes they really are interested in that. So you could do, program projects, but you could also participate, apply for specific pilot projects to really develop a new area. And then if you're a PI in a project that then is successful, you can then apply for a bigger grant later. So there's really, you can really take advantage of any mechanism that is out there to apply.
Any other comments on that question?
I guess I would just say that if you were a co-investigator for a number of grants and then you're going in on your own, I think you would want to make sure that you had statements and some letters perhaps indicating institutional support for your independence. So if you've always been a co-I, or you want to make sure that the reviewers know that you're viewed as an independent scientist, or you have the support of your institution to be an independent scientist.
There are also these small mechanisms like R03s that you could actually apply for a small grant to do like a proof of principle that will give you maybe a tool to do some particular research that is more your own. So you could also apply to these small mechanisms to kind of show that you can put together something that could help you to apply for a bigger grant. So, and those are like $50,000 for 2 years, or an R21, which is actually less, like hard to get because the pay lines are normally higher, and then it's 2 years. But I think R21 sometimes are a good transition between like being co-investigator with several people, and then now, okay, this is the question I really want to address. And actually R21s, they allow more risky projects, and they are not necessarily, they don't require preliminary data. So people put preliminary data, is not forbidden, but I think you don't need to provide preliminary data. It has to be, it's kind of high risk type of research. So maybe those are a good way to kind of transition into a more PI role.
Yeah. All right. This next question I will direct to Dr. Chen. How do you know when it is time to change to a different study section? Considering that in each round, if your score is improving, how many submissions should you, like how often should you pursue it? How many submissions do you continue to make before you decide to give up or pursue a different strategy?
Yeah, this is a very common question. And I think I have some personal experience with this as well. So I think the earlier question about program officer is relevant here. So getting feedback from the study section, right? So actually sometimes I think the program officers will really, in many cases, I think they have some ability to intervene. Like if there's somebody on the permanent panel who is maybe seen as a less receptive, like if there's that reviewer 3 who just keeps dinging you, I think they will often try to shift the reviewers in some cases, and so getting perspectives from that study section, from the program officer from that study section, but also maybe looking towards other institutes to see how your grant might be received in appropriate or not in a different, if you direct it to a different institute or different study panel. I think we used to have 3 shots, right? And so we would have an A2. And in those days, we would use that A2, right? And so now you have one resubmission, and then resubmitting it again as a new is often on the study panel. I think often there's enough memory if you're resubmitting reasonably soon that people will say, oh yeah, we've seen this again, and this person is really addressing what, it will come up that, sometimes you'll get the same reviewers. And so you will benefit, even though it's not an A2 So long as you are in every iteration addressing reviewer comments, no matter, whether it's going to the same study section or not, I think it's always wise to do your best to address study section review comments.
So
Any
if
other
I can
comments?
add something, I think they have
Yeah.
revamped a lot of the study sections right now. So in many of the divisions, they have really tried to divide them a little bit more because they were not maybe focused enough for some of the applications. So I think it's right now it's probably a good moment to apply because all the study sections or many study sections are new and are a little bit more focused. I hope they can find reviewers for all the different study sections we're putting. But I think, for example, in my field is much more defined right now, So I think it's gonna help a lot of investigators redirect their grant. And the other thing about addressing the comments, the grant resubmission is not the place to argue with a reviewer. It's really like a rebuttal of a paper. So you might want to do a lot of things, but if you want to get funded, you really have to address the comments of the study section. You cannot be stubborn and say, but I really want to do this. It's really like sometimes it becomes a little bit too much of a fight. And you have to really sit back and look a little bit and say, okay, this is what they're telling me. Maybe I'm proposing too much, or I'm really not clear in how I am going to do it. So try to address the main issue. And if you think they are not understanding, you need to rephrase your statements, and I think sometimes people get stuck in this like, oh, this reviewer hates me or this reviewer doesn't like me. It's more about really trying to remove your emotions of like what the criticisms that you get, because it really helps to be able to address, and I think it's perceived very positively if you're really responsive to the reviewers. So it's not a matter of like pride, I really want to keep my 3 aims the way they are or something like that. It really doesn't make too much sense most of the times, and it's more like okay, maybe I should really look at this, how it could improve my approach.
I have one thing to add, and that is now you have a sheet that you fill out that you can suggest study section panels for your grant. And Anna's right, they've changed the panels extensively in the last couple of years. The composition of the panels, what they focus on, and it is, I don't know, I have found it personally almost impossible to direct my grants to any particular study section. And the study section panels that I think are most appropriate is almost like my grants go to a different panel. So to want to direct your research to a particular panel is very difficult. And once it gets to a panel and your grant is inside that panel, you have to have an extremely good reason to move it to another panel. They will not move it unless you've shown that there's bias or something. So you have to stick with it and try and address the comments and deal with it as it is. And there is a mechanism for protest, but it takes longer than revising and resubmitting your grant. So it's not worth it.
All right. So I'm going to give you this next question, Dr. Benson. Although I think we touched on this earlier. Can you provide specific advice for renewing an R01 for the first time?
Right. And so, I think we did cover most of this. And so for renewing, it's like if you are renewing, as Ben said, you have to make sure that it's worth renewing and not writing a new one. The funding rates for new ones are now it used to be that it was like much more easy to get a renewal than to get a new submission, but that's not so true anymore. So you have to make sure that there's a good reason to renew it. And then if you do renew it, you have to make sure you're productive, because that the productivity in the last period and your ability to answer the questions previously is now a judged criterion in the grant that we have to read through and look at and see if in fact it's a metric that so if it's not strong, you might want to go in with a new one and something else. But if it is strong, then you highlight that and we judge that accordingly.
Any other additional comments on that?
I don't think so. I think we pretty much addressed it, but if anybody else has something to say, please.
I'm going to do one more question for Dr. Chen. It's, do R01s need to have a data collection aspect to them? In other words, can an R01 be based on analyzing existing data and running assays on previously collected biospecimens? And a related question for early stage investigators, how much data do you need for an R01 submission? I will also say that in the live Q&A right now, we have a question about how much preliminary data is required to support feasibility of approach. And I think this is a very common question, especially for new investigators, is how much data do I need? So.
Yeah. So for the data collection aspect for R01, the answer is simple. I think it's generally no, unless there's a specific RFA that you're responding to. And in many cases, even for clinical studies, sometimes RFAs and special mechanisms will actually stipulate, we don't want you to collect data because that's too expensive, and we want you to use existing biospecimens. So I've responded to some of those types of calls. So I think which points to like a something which I think we're generally speaking these we've been speaking very generally about maybe more generic R01 submissions, but also I think a really key aspect to finding a home for your grant is really to also comb those RFAs to make sure that if your grant fits a particular RFA, you obviously want to get it submitted to that RFA rather than to the general open R01 mechanism, which we've been focusing on. So in the other part of the question was, can it be based on existing data? Yes. And how much is enough? I think that's always a really key question. I think preliminary data for new investigators is about feasibility. It's that way for everybody, but I think new investigators are held to a little bit of a higher scrutiny, not necessarily higher level, but because you need to be able to show that you can do it on your own as an independent PI, and I think often you do want to have that independent PI publication, which I think can be super beneficial. It's not to say that everything that you're submitting needs to have a paper specifically on that hypothesis. But I think it's enough to show feasibility and independence and a track record. What others may have to add to that.
I mean, if I can add something there, I think sometimes one common mistake is to put too much preliminary data that is not relevant to the question that you're trying to address. So to show that you can do different things. And I think it's more not the amount of data, it's the type of data or the quality of the data you are providing. For example, in R21s, it's actually the kiss of death when people that are not required to submit preliminary data, they submit preliminary data that is not good. So it's like, do not submit data that is not required if it's not great data, So that's a common mistake. People send things that are maybe not completely mature and not completely analyzed, but because they want to show that they have data, So if it's not required, do not submit data unless it's really very supportive and very good for that grant. And I think for the R01s, it's the same, do not submit too much data, because what you need to do is identify the key data that you need to show feasibility. And it's not, you don't have to show 25 figures. You can show really good pieces of data that are proving that you can do what you're proposing to do. So it's really like a difficult balance because it's very subjective, but you don't put something there that is not totally related to what you're really trying to do, just to show that you can do it. That's what I would advise.
Okay.
Yeah, I have one more thing to add, and that is
Sure.
in the context of the feasibility question, I think that I completely agree that that is the key issue, that you look for whether or not the approach is feasible. But in judging the data, Anna's right about the quality of the data. People use that also to see whether or not the applicant can do appropriate statistics and whatnot. So even if it's preliminary, how would you approach analyzing the data? So it's a way to judge your analytical skills. And how you weight it, you know, is it underpowered? If it's underpowered, you say it's underpowered. And so I think that the quality of the data and the feasibility is really held to a high standard.
Great. Okay. So at this point, I will remind the participants that if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature. And so we're going to address some of the live questions now. So the first one, maybe I'll direct this to Dr. Fernanda Sesma. When do you need a letter of support? And do you need letters of support that demonstrate mentorship for an R01? Or is that not required for an R01?
I mean, it depends. If you're applying for your first R01 as a junior investigator, and you actually require some other lab to provide data or provide resources or provide advice, just get letter of support. I think the more the merrier. I think they will never kind of judge you negatively if you have too many letters of support, you know? So if that lab or that person is gonna have a significant impact or influence or participation in the project, you should get a letter of support, because it might be using a specific technique or a specific, you know, like let's say I want to do something with Diana and I want to do microscopy, and I really, you know, want my people to have access to the core. And, you know, I would love to get a letter from Diana to really show that she is committed, that she will help my people get the right amount of data. So anything that is not even like a typical collaboration, I will get a letter of support, so you know your institution is committed. And you also could have other letter of support, like a particular collaborator that you really want to collaborate with. So I think it's you need it when the technology is not established in your lab, and when they are providing something that that your team doesn't have, or that you need to make it to get the data faster or in a better way.
So here's another question. Would applying for your first R01 in your third year of your K01 award raise a red flag if you remain in the same department as your main K01 mentor, even if the main K01 mentor is not on your R01 application?
I can take that. I mean, I think that you're more than welcome to do it, but just by raising the question, it's like if you're asking yourself the question, yeah, you got to address it. It's one of, you know, anything that you think is a question, it means you have to address it. And so you need to have a letter from the chair saying that the chair supports your independent position. You should probably have a letter from the current PI, the K01 award mentor, saying, you know, this is not my project. This is your project. And this is the relationship that we have. And I'm not part of any of this going forward. And saying kind of stating very precisely what the different roles are. Each person needs to state those roles. So it's clear that the former PI has no interest, and the current PI, this is a main interest. And then there has to be some institutional support. All of those things are potential red flags that can be easily silenced.
Okay. All right. Here's another good question. What would you advise to do with a grant that is not discussed and has been triaged? How would you proceed?
Who wants to take this?
I will address the comments, like I consider sometimes it's really a borderline of a non-discussed or a discussed grant, so I think in general, every summary statement is gonna give you some feedback that it will help you at least understand if something wasn't clear, something is not, you are not providing enough data, what the problem was, why was that grant not discussed? And I think there are like difficult situations, the one in which they don't think the science is impactful enough, or they don't see the significance. Those are very difficult to address. But in general, it's something about the approach that maybe was really not well developed or not addressed properly. So if that got a very low number, then it kind of brought the whole score down. So I think it's important to go over the summary statement the same way as it was discussed. You should reapply. You should not really consider, oh, the grant was not discussed, I would just give up. So it's not really it's not the kiss of death. It's really something that you will get the feedback anyway, and I will address it the same way as it was discussed.
Yeah, I guess I would underscore that you never know kind of how close you were to the discuss line or not. And the feedback is really valuable. And personally, I've had more positive comments from things that have been triaged sometimes than things that have been discussed. And so I think that and in all cases, I've addressed them and moved forward. So,
Great point.
But again, if you have a grant that is not discussed twice, there is something wrong either with the study section you're sending it, with your approach, or with your question. So there is something that you should change.
All right, so here's a shorter question. Someone earlier mentioned that there is a high risk shorter grant that you can apply for, and someone would like to know what the code or the name of that.
R21.
R21, yeah.
Okay.
Those are 2 years. They normally give you 175, 1 year, 125, the second year, something like that. But they are really, you don't have to have preliminary data, but you can provide it if you have it. And it's 6 pages instead of, in a smaller, more doable. But it's also shorter, but I think it's very good if you're starting or you really have something that you want to develop a little bit further. And they're really very good stepping stone for application for an R01. So NIH really likes if they have funded an R21, the data generated there could be used to apply for an R01. So it's really a transitional grant that is very good for new investigators, and it's not percentile, so they really, and they have normally higher pay lines. So I think it's really worth it to apply for R21s, at least for these transitional stages, or when you have something that you really don't know for sure if it's going to pan out to be a bigger story.
Okay. So I think this will be the last, probably the last question we can get to. When you write a grant, you have a lot of sections that aren't for approach, like, for example, the equipment and the facilities description. And so someone would like to know, can you reuse the same description for these sections in multiple grants as long as it applies to the information in those multiple grants? Or will you get in trouble for doing that?
You can use it. Yes, you can use it. Facilities don't change, and it's not considered plagiarizing to use your facilities description in more than one proposal.
All right. Okay. Maybe we can do one more question since that was a short answer. If someone wants to know, can you exclude reviewers from a study section? And if so, how would you do that if you can't identify who the reviewer is that you want to exclude?
You can see the panels.
The submission, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so you can, if it's a standing study section, you can review who's a standing member of that particular study section. And if you're resubmitting, you can you can exclude people. I think in general, there's also the general exclusion, like if you feel that there's certain people in the field who may not be as receptive. I think that you can also mention that in your letter to CSR, right? Or there's a place where you can indicate that in the submission process.
I mean, it's a risk because you also have to avoid anything personal there. So you need to have a very clear justification for excluding someone. So I think is a tool to be used carefully, I would say, because you don't want to be like, I don't like this person hates me, or this person really doesn't like my research. So you have to have a solid argument to provide that is really like the research. So focus on the science, not focus on anything personal. If you really try to exclude the reviewer, why? Justify very clearly why.
Oh, this is actually, I think, in a related point in the committee, when everybody is weighing in on their opinions and putting down their scores, the entire committee has to put down their score. But if you vote outside of the range that's recommended by the primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers, like if I just thought, I don't like that person, I don't feel it, I have to announce it to the room and I have to say why. So there is a peer pressure not to just spuriously choose a terrible score for someone that you don't personally like.
And I think the reviewers have to declare also any conflict of interest,
True.
So if they have a personal competition, scientific competition, or like something is going on, they will have to recuse themselves from reviewing that grant. So there is a little bit of check and balances there that is supposed to be there for a reason, to avoid this type of personal issues between reviewers. But I think sometimes there is a legitimate reason, and in council, I've seen people actually appealing to that they don't think their grant was reviewed fairly, and those are actually considered, and then things are looked into, and it has to be established if there was really something unfair that was done, and I think you can appeal. There is not going to be a penalty, but that there is no guarantee you will win the appeal. But I think it's possible to do it if you think there is some unfair reviewing of your grant.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of our session, and so I'd really like to thank our 3 panelists for joining us and for answering all of these questions. We really appreciate it. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out the recording of this to all of the participants in the next week or so. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and thank you to our panelists. And we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Have a nice afternoon.